Subordinate clause has a subject and a predicate but cannot stand alone in or as a sentence. Such clauses appear in various positions in complex sentences. Some precede, others follow a main clause, and some are embedded in main clauses in ways that blur the grammatical and conceptual distinction between independence and dependence. Subordinate clauses often elaborate, qualify, or even undermine an idea or image in the main clause. In many English poems, clauses are building blocks of thought that invite the reader to look back at the beginning of the sentence, to do a mental double take in order to grasp the logical relations among a sentence's multiple parts. Subordinate clauses play syntactic roles similar to those played by three parts of speech: the noun, the adverb, and the adjective. Modern handbooks of grammar will give you full lists of the joining words that typically introduce the different kinds of subordinate clauses. Adverbial clauses, for instance, usually follow subordinate conjunctions. Conjunctions such as after, although, as if, because, whether, while. Shakespeare's sonnet 106, page 265, begins with such an adverbial clause. When in the chronicle of wasted time I see descriptions of the fairest wades. Adjectival clauses modifying a noun or pronoun are typically introduced by relative pronouns, that which, who, whom, whose, or by relative adverbs when, where, why. Shakespeare's sonnet 116, Let Me Not to the Marriage of Two Minds, page 266, uses an adjectival clause in its second main clause. Love is not love, Shakespeare writes, which alters when it alteration finds. Here, the subordinate clause follows and explains the contradictory preposition of the main clause. A good example, by the way, of the kind of predicate complement clause that Fenellosa thought poets should avoid. The lines illustrate not only an adjectival clause at work but also the complex relation that can exist between main and subordinate clauses. When we read Shakespeare's lines carefully, we mentally reorder the syntactic elements to place the subordinate or dependent from the Latin pendere, hanging, clause between rather than after the subject and its predicate complement, which is of course also love, the same word but different in syntactic function. If we visualize this main clause and its dependent one, only part of a much longer sentence in the sonnet, we could diagram the relationship this way: love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds. Such diagramming, which reminds us that in Latin sub means beneath, can often be a useful tool for sorting out relations among syntactic parts of poems. For a fine example of such diagramming, see James Wynne's rendering of the opening sentence of Milton's Paradise Lost, which Linda Gregerson reproduces and tangentially discusses in Anatomizing Death. Adjectival and adverbial clauses are fairly easy to discern because they modify a noun, pronoun, or verb in the main clause and can be diagrammed as hanging from depending on a word in the main clause. Noun clauses are harder to spot. They can be introduced by relative pronouns and also by other pronouns such as whoever, whomever, what, whatever, whichever. Moreover, noun clauses can follow many of the same subordinating conjunctions that signal adverbial clauses. The key to identifying noun clauses is to understand the syntactic functions and the poetic sentences with which we are working. Noun clauses may be subjects, direct objects, objects of prepositions, or predicate complements, but they always appear in statements that cannot stand alone. Sometimes, however, we have to excavate these clauses because the poet has omitted the joining or articulating words that would help us see the poem's syntactic skeleton clearly. If we know how the clauses are working syntactically, however, we can catch them. There are many rewards to doing so. Let's consider Shakespeare's Sonnet 106 as an illustration of how a poet uses interplay among clauses to make meaning. In the version below, to clarify the poem's structure, we have put the beginnings of main clauses, introductory words followed by subjects and verbs. in bold. We have put the beginnings of subordinate clauses in italic. Finding the main clause or clauses is the first step in analyzing this or any poem. Having found the poem's head and torso, as it were, we can proceed to finding the subordinate clauses, which can be compared to the poem's length. Whether the body rises into new life depends in part on who is reading it. How? In the sonnet, we have to wait patiently for a main clause to appear, and when it does, we may not recognize it, for its thought as well as its syntax seem paradoxically to depend on those of the initial dependent clause. Although the when then structure embodies a careful balance of ideas, each clause gets exactly 4 lines. The second clause is the main clause. When sets up expectations for the thought to be completed, and it is completed, albeit in a way that the rest of the sonnet elaborates and qualifies. We have found the main subject and verb, and we may well expect to find a direct object too. We do, momentarily, in the phrase their antique pen. But the syntax soon asks us to correct that idea, for the image of the pen is followed by a verb phrase that makes the pen the subject of a new little story. I see that their antique pen would have expressed even such a beauty. Experienced readers will add that the missing relative pronoun automatically, but even they will have to engage in some subliminal revision, reversing the usual forward motion of reading left to right on the page of a text in English. What advantage is there to recognizing the first main clause's direct object as a subordinate noun clause? Doing so helps us see that the object the poet finally sees in his main clause is not really an object, a thing at all. Instead, what the Shakespearean speaker sees here and elsewhere in his sonnets is an